So let's talk through a few ideas for collecting an army of inquisitorial Xenos hunting space marines, with a few thoughts on starting Deathwatch in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Deathwatch, and in this video I thought we'd talk about starting the faction, with a few of the reasons and downsides of doing so, a few ideas for planning an army and getting your first miniatures on the tabletop, talking through a few of the new Deathwatch rules, the various different ways that you can field them, and some ideas to expand upon an army. Lots to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, why might you want to collect a Deathwatch Space Marine army in the first place? The Deathwatch represents an interesting force of Space Marines in Warhammer 40k. They're basically the militant wing of the Ordo Xenos, the alien hunting branch of the Inquisition, and their formations are maintained in watch fortresses, able to provide specialist kill teams of Space Marines with expert knowledge for dealing with all manner of Xenos. If the forces of the Inquisition should deem that they've got a threat necessary to take down with absolute maximum surety. The Deathwatch Space Marines themselves are drawn from all number of different chapters, displaying their heraldry on their right shoulder pad, doing a rotation for the Deathwatch before bringing knowledge back to their chapter, and display the silver litany Xenomortis on their left. There's also the mysterious Black Shield Deathwatch, who forsake their chapter's heraldry, and often fighting to atone for past sins or transgressions. Most commonly they tend to be deployed at a squad level or maybe several squads working in concert, though on rare occasions they do deploy the full might of a watch fortress at scale when there's a next level threat to be handled. But in general, Deathwatch kill teams are somewhat of a precious last resort and tend to be equipped with some of the finest and most exotic Imperial weaponry, perhaps being deployed to assassinate a key Orc war boss, or take down a linchpin Tyranid synapse organism, or maybe counter a disturbing Xenos psychic ritual that their specialist knowledge is really going to help them with. They are kind of notable recently for having a starring role in Space Marine 2 as well. Lieutenant Titus himself starting the game under the Deathwatch and delivering a virus bomb to stall the Tyranid invasion. Miniatures wise, the Deathwatch have a small range of unique kits as well as access to the enormous Space Marine range, which does mean that you have an enormous amount of models to choose from, given that they're basically the single biggest and most updated army in 40k. The Deathwatch range maybe hasn't seen quite as much care and attention from Games Workshop in the more recent Primaris age though. They haven't really been playable as their own standalone army for all that long, though it's just kind of notable that Games Workshop released them and then didn't give them any sort of Primaris model updates or anything. In the 8 years since the upscale Space Marines have been a thing, even for one of the other more divergent chapters that haven't really had their turn yet in the Space Wolves, they've still got a couple of character models and an upgrade sprue at the very least. It does mean their range is maybe in a bit of an awkward spot. The remaining firstborn Space Marines feel like they're going to be retired and updated over time, though given Games Workshop haven't actually done anything with them, it's not really very clear when that might be. And it seemed that earlier this year they were kind of borderline whether or not they wanted to have them remain as their standalone faction or roll them into a Greater Inquisition book. Those shaky bits aside though, a bunch of their models are really quite nice ones. Their most core central kit are the Deathwatch Veterans, and that one you get 5 firstborn Space Marines with a fair bunch of different gear and fun shoulder pads and things. They're pretty much the most useful kit in flexibility and theme wise. They've got their unique transport flyer in the Corvus Blackstar, a gunship able to deliver kill teams to the front and provide some close range fire support. It also comes with built-in stealth generators. They have a couple of unique characters, Watch Captain Artemis, whose model was based on an old upscaled Inquisitor model, and the Watchmaster who fights with a Custodes-style Guardian Spear. He's pretty much sort of their Chapter Master equivalent. They also have an upgrade sprue with some Deathwatch upgrades, coming with a bunch of Tacticus-style shoulder pads and a couple of slightly bigger ones. And they still do have Kill Team Cassius on sale as well as an online only one. These are a bunch of monopose Deathwatch veterans with a whole bunch of different themes and different specialists in their range. Really fun miniatures that are dedicated to their individual chapters and show a lot of character, though Games Workshop did move their datasheets to a Legends one and they didn't decide to bring it back with the new digital index they released. Otherwise though, as of December, you can now use pretty much all the standard Space Marine units once again, and they can fight alongside and use a bunch of Deathwatch rules. You can use standard intercessors or more bulky armoured elites like aggressors, and quite a lot of the Primaris models can be formed into their own flavour kill teams as well. You can also make use of all of the bigger and stompier stuff for Space Marines. Deathwatch maybe aren't quite as much known for their tanks or dreadnoughts, though they could certainly provide a bit of support to some on-the-ground infantry. Price-wise, Space Marines tend to be a little bit less expensive than some armies out there in 40k, mainly due to the amount of discount deals they tend to get, particularly with starter sets and additional launch boxes. I'd say that generally holds true for Deathwatch. I guess if you're buying lots of fancy shoulder pads, that could be a bit of added expense, as some of the Space Marine Elite infantry isn't exactly the best value in terms of money for the points, but in general I certainly wouldn't say that they're going to be the most expensive faction to collect in 40k. Gameplay wise, I'll talk a little bit more about their options later, but Deathwatch maybe feel like one of the single factions with their rules in the weirdest spot in the game right now. In December, they had the return of their digital index, so it feels like the main way to play them if you do want to play a full Deathwatch army will be to go via Collect Space Marines and then use the digital index download for their unique stuff. But you've also got the option to play them as an Ordo Xenos army, so take a limited number of Deathwatch units and have the option to take other Imperial agents to help fill out the army, or you can potentially play them as allies by throwing in a couple of kill teams to another army out there. I think if you were setting out to collect Deathwatch as their standalone faction, I'd certainly be most tempted to focus on the Codex Space Marines and Index sort of point of view, though I guess having multiple ways to play could give you some more options for a bit of variety once you have a collection established. In any case, their playstyle classically tends to be squads of elite infantry, often doing close range shooting with special issue ammunition and frag cannons and the like, and maybe quite often being deployed to firefights via teleportation or transports. They can certainly handle themselves well in melee as well, and often have big punchy elite kill teams that can hit incredibly hard and maybe have some interesting combos going on with certain stratagems or characters or enhancements. Perhaps some of the difficulty with playing them is often that you have big punchy kill teams that will hit really quite hard, but maybe don't tend to be all that enormously tough when it comes to taking fire in return. And it might sometimes be a tricky thing to be able to kill more than your points cost or trade up a bit if they do manage to jump out and hit something hard, but they're also very expensive in themselves and might well get killed in return. Given that you can basically field them as pretty much standard Codex Space Marines though, they could tailor themselves to all sorts of other playstyles if you want to. They could have a credible go at using quite a lot of the detachments, so you certainly could have Deathwatch armies that function really differently. Currently power-wise it's kind of early days since their index coming out in December. It's maybe remaining to see exactly how well they'll do in competitive play with that new index, though at least on paper it does look fairly strong, good enough supporting rules, and in particular the Primaris kill teams and Terminator datasheets do look like they've got a lot of threat and a bunch of fun datasheet rules. Overall, there's definitely a lot of cool stuff to attract people to the faction. I feel like it's probably worth just mentioning that it does feel like they're an army that has some more problems versus some of them. As mentioned, there is the risk of those firstborn models being updated if you went too heavy on the veterans kits. As a result, I'd probably be at least tempted to have a good mix of firstborn and primaris, just to maybe help mitigate the risk a little bit if Games Workshop do somehow replace veterans and it doesn't translate over very well to, say, a primaris kit when that does happen. Aside from models, I would say that rules as well perhaps feel like they're one of the least stable factions in the game. Lots of people were expecting that they were the army that had the most chance of being removed from the game before, and then that basically turned out to be true as they got rolled into Imperial agents, and it seems that Games Workshop only really restored them to full faction status, mainly with fan backlash, and perhaps things like Space Marine 2 and a recent Deathwatch animation that basically raised their profile a little bit in the public consciousness perhaps, and prodded Games Workshop into making a digital rule support for them, even if they don't actually get their codex in 10th edition. There's also the Primaris kill teams that have rule sets for different units but no individual boxes for them, and things like that have always been at risk of either being removed outright or just having their rules significantly reinterpreted each time there's a new codex or rule set, so the combos that you collect might not necessarily be the combos that you can wind up fielding next edition, and even more so for optimal combos of war gear. It does feel like Games Workshop have made a bit of a mess of Deathwatch rules in 10th edition, seeming with their goal to make them less prominent by putting them into the Imperial Agents Codex, but because they've had to backtrack on that, they sort of have two different rule sets at the same time, and have kind of given themselves more effort and admin if anything. In any case, I'd certainly try and collect a robust collection of Space Marines that you could use for other forms if they do really quite radically reinterpret Deathwatch at some stage, and just be aware that that could be a bit of a risk with going in with the faction as well as the firstborn things. Maybe one more gripe rules-wise is that their Chorus Blackstar is kind of their big flyer heavy hitter. It's definitely not unusable in-game, and particularly at a casual level, though it does seem that Games Workshop have a bit of a stealth balance policy of keeping flyers to be not particularly optimal in 10th edition, and that's maybe a bit unhelpful for a faction that only really have 4 unique model kits that you can currently play 1-for-1 in-game, and one of them just happens to be a flyer that Games Workshop seems to have no interest in balancing this time round. With all that said though, if you want to embrace the positives and the cool tropes and make an army to stand the long vigil against the dark, I'd probably first bear in mind all the places that you could gain info about the Deathwatch. If you're going with Codex Space Marines, that probably would be a worthwhile purchase at some stage, though you can certainly get all the Deathwatch profiles for free for download under the Warhammer 40K download section of Warhammer Community. For building army list, you could think about things like New Recruit, Warhapedia, or Games Workshop's app for rules and making army lists happen. Potentially try out models before you actually buy them, maybe having a game or two on Tabletop Simulator if that's something that you do, or proxying other models for them to get a bit of a feel as to how the faction works in an actual game. There's loads of content out there on YouTube, of course. I've made the occasional Deathwatch video, and I'll certainly aim to cover any rules changes for them. There's plenty of battle reports, painting guides, and lore videos on other channels. If you wanted some dedicated Deathwatch content, Christian von Carmian has made some good Deathwatch videos for 10th edition, well worth checking out. Otherwise, it can just be handy following along with social media. Most of the core Space Marine factions have Discord servers, Facebook groups, or subreddits. They can just be alright places to see what other people are painting, what sort of decisions they're making with their armies, and maybe be a place to ask a few very basic questions if you're new. Otherwise, beyond that, you can start planning what sort of army you'd like to wind up with at the end of it. As mentioned, maybe making a list on new recruit could be a good idea, perhaps planning out a roughly 1,000 point or 2,000 point army list. And I do feel like a faction that you could really collect in a few different ways. You'd have to decide whether or not you're going for Space Marines with Deathwatch units, or building around the Ordo Xenos detachment, and beyond that, if you're going to be collecting a balanced army, or going with Deathwatch of one particular theme, you could make them really quite armoured if you wanted, or say focus entirely on Primaris Space Marines, or entirely on the Firstborn, or perhaps just collect to a competitive army that works at the moment for the Black Spear Task Force and take these Space Marine units that make sense to support that. I feel like basically every Deathwatch collector will build up a good number of their kill team units though. I'd be tempted both to get some veterans and also some mixed Primaris ones on the go, and then perhaps back up with a few bigger, heavier hitting Space Marine vehicles and some objective support units. While you're working things out for the army as well, it's probably helpful to paint up a test model or two, just to work out how you're going to apply your colour scheme to an army at large. I feel like some veterans could be quite a good place to start there. They've got your Litany Xenomortis shoulder pads, a selection of ones for various different chapters on the other side, and a bunch of heraldry and things. In general, they maybe don't tend to be the hardest army to paint in the world. You can get a lot of work done by spraying black, dry brushing over the silver if you want to, and then maybe doing a little bit of edge highlighting or dry brushing to pick out some edges of the black armour. And you can have an army that looks really quite effective on the tabletop quite quickly. You can definitely go really quite strong on the hobby-wise and creativity section of it though. I've certainly seen a few armies where they've really thought about the personality of each individual Space Marine, and maybe tried to match up the war gear choices or unit styling for each individual guy from each chapter, maybe say having an Ultramarine with a bolter, or an Iron Hand Space Marine with a great big gun, or Imperial Fist with a Power Fist maybe. One of the characteristic things about them are the Litany Xenomortis shoulder pads that they have, and there's a few options for getting your hands on those. Games Workshop do sell an upgrade sprue, though it's maybe a little bit on the expensive side for just a few shoulder pads. You do get some in the Deathwatch Veterans kit, though only really enough to do a squad, and it could be a bit of a significant extra expense. You could certainly have a look to see 3D printing creators if they had any on sale, something that's close enough to stand in and use an alternative if you are thinking that you want literally every single Space Marine in the army to have those. I've certainly seen people just paint one shoulder pad and arm silver though and not worry about it too much. I feel like it's maybe not the most uncommon thing in 40k to just assume that the text is too small to read as it's too small to freehand. Moving on to miniatures though, and talking through the Deathwatch range in general, I'd probably be most tempted to start out with a standard Deathwatch veteran kit. Even if you are aiming to have a good portion of Primaris, I feel like it's worth getting at least 1 or 2 copies of that, as they are basically the best themes models at the moment for them, and has a fair few fun themed bits as well that you might be able to make use of in other models and conversions. Otherwise though, if just going down and collecting Space Marines more generally, you could start with one of the Space Marine discount box sets as a jump into the faction to get lots of models on the table. Perhaps a starter set box to get the Combat Patrol Space Marines, maybe a Leviathan box half or one of the many other Combat Patrols. It might be more tempting to focus on one of them where the models could be used as part of specific Deathwatch datasheets or kill teams though. For the Deathwatch veterans themselves, they're $45, £28 or €35, which maybe isn't too bad compared with modern Games Workshop prices for 5 Space Marine veterans. They'd usually charge an extra $15 on that at the moment, and I do think it's quite a fun kit. You get a bunch of interesting weapons such as a couple of heavy thunder hammers, an Infernus heavy bolter and a frag cannon, and in general they can often be one of the better choices to load out the unit with, just lots of damage at range and melee. Though as mentioned, it does feel like each edition a new Deathwatch squad might well be the best loadout for them, and you might need to do a bit of rearming or remodelling if you don't want things to be literally optimal all the time. As mentioned though, they do have quite a lot of fun bits. I quite like the amount of sculpted chapter shoulder pads that you have for a bunch of different armies, plus they've got some fun things like Deathwatch shotguns and that rather nice sculpted shield that you can see, plus the Xenophase blade for the Sergeant is rather cool too. In any case, currently I think they're priced enough to be a really quite an efficient unit, have some very hard hitting gear, and while I'm sure they will eventually get a Primaris update for this kit, there's no particular indication it's going to happen anytime soon. We shall probably be safe for the rest of 10th edition, though you never really know with Games Workshop. Otherwise, if jumping into Deathwatch in a big way, I'd probably at least at some point set out to get at least one of each of their other unique things. It's not like there's a huge amount of them, Probably the Watchmaster would be the next one I'd prioritise. He's often been a pretty relevant HQ and still feels like he'll be that way, what with the free stratagem things going on and having a few enhancements that tend to be a bit better for him. Otherwise though, beyond unique Deathwatch things, you could go for one of the more generic Space Marine starter things, maybe one of the 40k starter sets to get Combat Patrol for Space Marines. The Leviathan sculpts were quite nice ones. And as ever with that, don't actually buy the actual Combat Patrol Space Marine box set, instead most likely get them through the 40k starter set, as it would be directly cheaper and you'd get a bunch of Tyranids for some target practice. The Space Marine half of the Leviathan box has also been a really good deal recently, if you can find somewhere that's still selling it at a fair price. I saw a few places going for something in the region of £100 to $150 or so, which I don't think is unreasonable for that. You do get solidly more miniatures than you would at most normal Combat Patrols. Otherwise, for Combat Patrol boxes, the Dark Angels one isn't unusable. The Intercessors and Hellblasters could be interesting enough for a Fortis team. Maybe the Blade Guard aren't the first thing that you'd think of for Deathwatch. I guess you could use the Gravis Captain to go with an Indomitor one though. There's the Space Wolf one, which maybe feels a bit more oddball. Mainly depends on whether or not you want the Invictor, and it does have the more Space Wolf themed character here. I guess you could always induct him into the Deathwatch with a Xenomortis shoulder pad and the appropriate colour scheme though. And there's also the Vanguard Task Force. That could be handy enough if you want to get a Spectre's kill team on the go, I guess. And the Suppressors could just be a cheap support objective dropping unit. There's definitely a whole load of credible ways that you could start Space Marines at the moment. Most of the units tend to be usable enough, and if used in the right battlefield role, could be good to fit into a bunch of competitive armies. And I feel like it's more the case that you want to be balancing to have a few objective support units with a few really hefty damage dealers that can handle monsters and vehicles and things. And also have your sort of core units that you support with characters, which for Deathwatch case would normally be kill teams. As ever, when buying Warhammer 40k miniatures in general, I'd always bear in mind the different options, particularly if you're newer to the whole thing. Direct from Games Workshop and their Warhammer web store is usually the most reliable, but also the most expensive. If you're wanting new plastic miniatures, generally the cheapest place tends to be the various discount retailers out there, which can be somewhere between 10 and 21% off depending on where you are around the world. I do have a whole bunch of those linked down in the video description. There's Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Venomous Workshop in Canada for 10%, Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%, and Tash and Geldeep in Germany for 16% off. A big thank you to anyone who chooses to pick up stuff through those links if they are buying something. It does help to support the channel a little bit, though of course doesn't cost any extra to do so. There's other options beyond that though. There's also the second-hand market, which Space Marines tend to have a good turnover rate on. As a popular faction, you'll often see second-hand minis being listed online, so it could be quite nice to bulk out the forces nice and cheap. Quality certainly can be a bit variable though, depending on how well people have looked after the miniatures, and in this day and age there's plenty of 3D printing creators and third-party manufacturers. As mentioned, could be a nice one for shoulder pads in particular for the Deathwatch. They don't tend to be too hard to find if you search them. Next up, I thought we'd talk through the Deathwatch unit rules in brief and just have a very quick spin through their index. When you are adding units to the army, bear in mind that there's a few things that as per the normal rules Deathwatch can't take. A bunch of the more standard Firstborn squads such as Devastator squads, Scout squads, Tactical squads, and the standard Terminator variants as they have their own Terminator unique datasheet. This is if you're going with the Deathwatch index version of course, and it means that if you're going with that version you can't also ally in Deathwatch as well, it's one or the other. Briefly going through their units, the veterans are 100 points per 5. They really can be equipped in a whole variety of ways, but big hitting frag cannons and furnace heavy bolters and the mighty damage 3 Deathwatch Thunderhammer generally tend to be pretty reasonable ways to go. And they've got really quite flexible character attachment, as it's everything that can join Sternguard as well. They're basically the same datasheet between the core index and the Imperial Agents one, but get lots more support in the index version, particularly with things like Oath of Moment and a whole load more Space Marine characters that could join them. Deathwatch Terminators are a pretty powerful datasheet, 180 points per 5 of them, and that gets you 3 heavy weapons, which is kind of unusual. They're maybe not the most easy units to actually go out and collect though, as in theory an optimal loadout could be something like, say 2 Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Terminators paired with 3 with Cyclone missile launchers perhaps, and that's not something that comes in any one kit. I'd also be a bit dubious about that sticking around for the extreme long term as well, given that it doesn't actually come in a box and Games Workshop usually says no model, no rules. Certainly could be a good excuse to get your hands on a few of the new Terminators though, and potentially you could just do a little bit of proxying or converting for some exact loadouts. They are really quite strong for that amount of heavy weapon firepower and tanky Terminator stat lines for 180 points. Then we've got the Primaris kill teams. There's the Talon Strike one, which is 290 points for basically 5 Jump Intercessors plus 5 Inceptors. They do hit really quite hard from reserve, can get a bit of extra AP and use the special issue ammo stratagems rather well. There's the Fortis kill team with the Intercessors with their scary bolt rifles with strength 5, AP2 and lethal hits at base. The best setup for this one at the moment feels like it's a couple of Desolation Squad Marines, then 4 Hellblasters and fill out the rest with Intercessors. They can definitely pack a punch in terms of shooting, and interesting to have a very valuable bit of indirect firepower with a Vengor launcher in the squad. It does depend on how much you like the look of those Desolation Squad ones though. There's the Indomitor one, which is the Gravis kill team, 270 points, and they've got some very scary bolt rifles. They could be hitting at strength 7, AP2, damage 2 with lethal hits. I'd certainly be tempted to include the Aggressors in the squad as well. They both have solidly savage shooting and nice melee with those twin-linked power fists. Finally, we've got the Spectres kill team for 200 points. They've got good ball control with Infiltrate and Scout. They have the 6+ Feel No Pain from the Infiltrators, and also get a fun move-shoot-move with an Eliminator's Instigator Bolt Carbine, which seems well worth having. Even with the boosted bolters, they still won't hit quite as hard as some of the other options, but do seem like quite a nice skirmish unit, and should be able to handle lighter infantry and threaten medium infantry at least fairly well. I think when going about collecting the Primaris kill teams, I'd be most tempted to basically buy 4 squads of Space Marine Primaris and just paint them up as is, as opposed to trying to go out to look out for partial squads, or say get the exact ones that you need and resell the rest, and then basically that will give you a bit more option as to how you run them in the future. You say you might pick up a squad of Hellblasters, and they could either fill in slots in an Indomitor kill team or be fielded as their own individual units if that makes more sense. As mentioned as well, I think that will make them a bit more edition proof. Say if the Primaris kill teams all change around next time around, you'll still be able to field them as standard Space Marine units, so we'll have a bit of a fallback. Then otherwise we've got the Watchmaster for 105 points, basically being a captain with 3 stratagems and advanced shoot and charge, pretty nice for mobility there. And Captain Artemis is 65 points. He gives the unit lethal hits like a lieutenant, which is nice enough, and also has a stands up on death rule. I feel like a lot of the time, for actually buffing the squad, you might be more tempted by the fallback shoot and charge the lieutenant has, though he does have some good personal stats, and the stand up on death thing is genuinely quite nice. He's got a bit of an okay melee between that combi weapon and his close combat as well. I say both the Watchmaster and Captain Artemis are usable enough. Finally, we've got the Corvus Blackstar at 180 points. I would say that compared with the majority of flyers out there, it's a little bit more usable than most, though still is one that's pretty infrequent to be included in Deathwatch army lists. It can either have a twin las cannon versus twin assault cannon, both of which are pretty nice, a choice of 2 sets of missiles and a free hurricane bolter, plus transports the squad of Deathwatch into the fight. I think to make one of them work, I'd be most tempted to have one of them on the board and deliver a big kill team combo with big damage turn 1, basically able to move 20 inches and drop them off to deal a bunch of damage. The biggest risk is just getting shot down before it's time though. They're pretty hard to hide even when they're in hover mode. I'd say its durability with a stealth is still merely okay, as opposed to being standout great for such a big model with some valuable cargo. Then to put them all together, you can choose other detachments within Core Codex Space Marines, though I feel like the majority of Deathwatch players will gravitate towards the Black Spear one for their fluffy rules, and the rules do synergize pretty well with the kill teams, particularly the stratagems. The core rule is nice enough. You get 1 turn of lethal hits against everything, 1 turn of sustained hits against everything, and 1 turn of critical hits gaining precision, and nice enough damage buffs to have army-wide. Maybe it could be good to use the big damage dealer ones, say turn 2 and turn 3 when the fighting is usually at its max. As ever with 40k, usually if you're wounding things on a 5+, the lethal hits tends to be the most effective, or sustained hits is better against things that you're wounding on a 3+, and they're even on a 4. For stratagems, they've got Armour of Contempt, which is now a fair bit more relevant in melee versus ranged. It got nerfed so it only affects 1 unit in the balanced data slate. And beyond that, I'd probably say that Adaptive Tactics is one of the most interesting ones, that allows you to flex into the damage boost of the main core mission rule, and you can do it on 2 different kill teams at the same time, so that's just very efficient damage dealing there. Maybe the other really standout one is site-to-site teleportation as well. You can have 2 kill teams return to reserve and then deploy via deep strike basically, and that could be very nice for getting the alpha strike with some kill teams that have just rinsed 1 target, may manage to either hide or survive enemy firepower, and then want to drop against something new. I certainly wouldn't underestimate that on non-kill team stuff though. Could just be nice for teleporting things around the board to score stuff, or could be very scary to deliver certain ranged damage dealers such as Centurions with their las cannons, or Inceptors to drop within 3 inches and then maybe threaten to do so again. Then finally we've got the special issue ammunition stratagems, which I thought were generally a little bit more lackluster before, but with the soup top Primaris kill teams they feel a bit more punchy. In particular, the Kraken rounds for a bit of extra AP is going to be reliable extra damage against a whole bunch of targets, particularly with those punchy AP2 bolt guns on the go. Hellfire rounds could often be the best choice against a bunch of stuff though, with anti-infantry 2+ on offer. Dragonfire maybe feels a little bit more situational. Kraken rounds is usually directly better unless you need to advance and shoot. Finally, the Deathwatch detachment does get some very good enhancements in my opinion. The Thief of Secrets is a pretty great melee one, 25 points for an all-round combat boost, pretty excellent on a captain or lieutenant. The Osseous Key is the biggest miss for me, it's just a bit specific against vehicles, so not really all that great unless you absolutely know that you're fighting them to start with. The Tome of Exoclades can allow you to have double Oath of Moment, which is rather good. 40 rolls to hit against something is pretty massive, and I feel like that could be very scary with Stern Guard as well, given that their damage output just goes absolutely through the roof between shooting and fighting against the Oath of Moment targets, and having a turn where you get that in 2 different places could make a unit of them a lot more viable. Then the Beacon Angelus is just a fairly flat good one, 25 points for Deep Strike for the Bearer's unit, and being able to rapid ingress for 0 CP. That just seems very effective on a big mixed kill team that could deploy somewhere safe, then move out, shoot something and go on to charge. You're potentially setting up for a massive turn of damage dealing and tearing down multiple enemy units if it's in the right situation. That could be quite nice on an Indomitor or Fortis kill team, or just the standard Deathwatch veterans. Overall, between all that, I feel like the Black Spear Task Force has got quite a lot going for it, and there's definitely interesting things for a bunch of the other Space Marine units out there as well, and not just literally the kill teams only. Just to cycle back to the other ways that you can fill Deathwatch though, the other main way that you could do so would be the Ordo Xenos detachment in the Imperial Agents Codex, where compared with a more normal use the core Codex Space Marines and then get additional units, instead of that you just literally get the 4 Deathwatch datasheets, the Corvus Blackstar, Veterans, Watchmaster and Artemis. They don't have any of the Primaris kill teams or other Space Marine units in the Codex, but they do have some in Legends rules if you happen to be using those, though even then the Legends versions for the most part aren't quite as good as the ones in the new Index. Then in that you could either use the Ordo Xenos detachment, which is pretty similar in styling to the Black Spear, but it's just going to basically wind up being directly worse as you have so much fewer unit access and no Oath of Moment or any of the other Space Marine support units. Or you could use Deathwatch as maybe a bit more of a balanced force to have a few units using some Imperialis fleet tricks, maybe alongside some Navy breachers and other inquisitorial stuff. I feel like at the moment, if you're collecting Deathwatch as a core faction, this one's more of a different way that you could play for variety. You certainly could collect Deathwatch Space Marines and then have a bunch of Imperial agents that you build up over time as well, and in theory have a couple of different ways to play them. At the moment though, unfortunately, the Imperial Agents Codex is really badly balanced, and Games Workshop hasn't made any indications to think that they're necessarily going to try and fix that anytime soon. And if you do want access to the rest of the Space Marine Codex and all the fun stuff that can have, then this isn't the way that you'd be able to use that. Otherwise, you can potentially have a Deathwatch force that you could use as allied agents to another Imperial army, and that's just by going by the standard Imperial Agents rule that allows you to include retinues and characters and put them in another army. At say a 2000 point game, you'd be allowed 2 retinue units and 2 character units, so you could say have a Watchmaster, Captain Artemis, and either a couple of Deathwatch veteran squads or 1 Deathwatch veteran squad and a Corvus Blackstar. Weirdly enough, they count as retinue units for some reason. At the moment, within the Imperial Agents things, I feel like the models have the points cost where they're playable and realistically aren't going to hold back an army by crazy amounts if they choose to take some of them along. But I feel like for just about any Imperial faction, they're probably not likely to be the optimal choice versus other things out of the Codex or even other allies. They are basically just going to be Deathwatch units but -1 somewhat, with no access to Oath of Moment or any of their Black Spear stratagems either out of Imperial Agents or the Index. In any case though, rules aside, if starting a new Deathwatch army myself, I'd probably initially prioritise getting at least some of their unique units, and then probably gradually building up towards 1 or more of their Primaris kill teams, taking things slow and steady, buying miniatures, getting them painted up and on the table, and getting some games in with them before expanding further. I feel like one of the things that you generally need to prioritise at least fairly early on with Space Marines is to have some dedicated anti-tank choices, as it can be really quite easy to collect a whole bunch of things that can absolutely destroy enemy infantry, but aren't really going to punch up against armies of, say, knights or vehicles or monsters that well. Even if some of the kill teams can threaten to do that at least okay, particularly with lethal hits on the go when they need it. Maybe things like a Gladiator Lancer or 2 or a Repulsor Executioner could be a fairly easy one just to slot in to support the kill teams, just making enemy armor a bit more honest and not knowing that they can just sit out in the open and you don't have things to threaten them at range. I feel like they could be a good complement if you're willing to put a few tanks in your army. as well as some dedicated anti-tank. I'd probably aim to get some small cheap objective skirmish style units as well as just the big effort kill teams. Deathwatch don't get access to Space Marine scouts, which often fill that role in a bunch of chapters, but Space Marines do have tons of options that they can use, things like intercessors, infiltrators, eliminators, jump intercessors or incursors, maybe even things like suppressors or reavers potentially after the points changes. They all have some of their pros and cons and the exact role that they tend to be best at within the army, but some manner of small units to be working on primary or secondary objectives and doing grunt work and screening that you don't really want the actual big points cost kill teams to be handling. Perhaps to call out one other specific unit as well, and I really feel like Hellblasters are one of the better choices for starting Space Marine armies at the moment. Compared with the vast majority of things in the army, they get more points in the box for the amount spent, plus they're just generally quite easy to use with big scary plasma guns that can take a chunk out of most things, and they're even somewhat rewarding as they shoot in death as well, so even if you do manage to get them all killed pretty quickly, at least they'll have a consolation prize as they go down. In Deathwatch, I guess they also have the added bonus of being able to fill out slots in an Optimal Fortis team. Otherwise, maybe for another option to expand, bear in mind that you might see copies of the old Combat Patrol Deathwatch around from time to time. These haven't been on sale for a long time from Games Workshop directly, but I feel like they were kind of slow sellers to the point where they might persist from time to time in independent gaming shops. That one could be a way to get you a few more Litanies and Immortis shoulder pads, plus some aggressors, intercessors, and a couple of characters. I certainly wouldn't go paying over the odds for this one though. I would have rated it as one of the worst combat patrols when it was out. The discount wasn't exactly enormous, and the lieutenant being in there basically meant that you had one guy that looks pretty much the same as a standard intercessor, but Games Workshop just value him at like £20 or so. Just made this one overall a bit less exciting for me. The units definitely aren't terrible though, and it could have enough value if you can find it at the right price, and you did really want to get those shoulder pads. In any case, that's a whole bunch of Deathwatch discussion. To round up, I thought I'd just finish up with just one very rough army list idea. Nothing hugely optimal or thought through, but putting a whole bunch of Deathwatch kill teams in a list that feels like it could function okay. It feels like it certainly wouldn't be a pushover if played well at a casual level. For this one I've gone with a Watchmaster with the Beacon Angelis, deep striking in with the Deathwatch veterans, and they'll be hitting super hard with Thunderhammers, frag cannons, and a bunch of other melee gear, the Watchmaster being able to hand out some discounted stratagems as well. There's then a Fortis kill team for a bunch of nasty close range shooting, taking the Plasma Incinerators and the Desolation Squad Marines. They could be a nice choice for some stratagems. There's an Indomitor kill team with some Boltstorm aggressors along with the scary bolt rifles. They're joined by Captain in Gravis armor, and he's got the Tome of Ectoclades for some extra hit rerolls when you need it. There's a Spectrus kill team for infiltrating into the midfield with a Phobos Librarian. Blocking shooting at greater than 12 inches and being able to move shoot move should make them hard to catch up with, and potentially could be pinging out of terrain, taking chunks out of enemy units and then hiding again. There's two Deathwatch Terminator squads with triple Cyclone missile launchers. Could be another interesting unit for rapid ingressing maybe, but just in general they're pretty tough and pretty dangerous between their range and melee. One unit of 5 infiltrators to hold the home objective, denying deep strike if the rest of the stuff is skirmishing for the midboard, and then also lightly loitering in the home field are the long-range scary gladiator lancers, a pair of those just to deal with any big scary threats that are loitering in the enemy backfield and maybe screened from your kill team damage, and making sure that enemy armor can't relax when there's even one of those on the table. Overall, hopefully that's striking the balance between a pretty fun themed Deathwatch list that also could be fairly scary with a whole bunch of big damage punches from all those kill teams. In any case though, I'll leave this one there for now. Let me know your thoughts on collecting Deathwatch in 10th edition, and I'll look forward to hearing any other insights, plans, or what current Deathwatch players are doing down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new things most days. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.